Thanks for your patience. So thank you, Lee and Philip, for inviting me to present today and tell you about farm to fabric to fashion, which has been my life for the last 10 years. And thanks to Massimiliano and Linda at Polymoda for helping us pass this knowledge down to the next generation. So I'm Angel Chang. I am a zero carbon women's wear designer based in New York City. And my mission is to reconnect people with nature, educate them about climate change. And my goal is to transition as many people as possible to a zero carbon lifestyle as soon as we can. And I don't mean just carbon neutral or net zero, because those means that you're still emitting carbon, you're just paying offsets to make yourself feel better. I really mean not emitting any carbon that's man-made at all. And the reason for this is because we all know what will happen if we don't change. The way we live is contributing to extreme weather that has resulted in flooding, storms, droughts, and wildfires, the most which has been happening in the past decade and in the past year. And we're told that we need to have our carbon footprint by 2030 or else face even more extreme weather in the future because the planet is warming. But 2030 is 8 years away, and we need to start making this transition in our lifestyle now. And when we take a look at the richest 10% in the world, they have a net income of $32,000. And they end up contributing half of all carbon emissions globally. That includes those in the US, in Europe, and 1/5 of China and India. And so we know that fashion contributes up to 10% of carbon emissions, mainly because we've built the industry to run on fossil fuels. And even 15 years ago, I was one of those polluting designers because that's what the industry taught me to design. And so I'll tell you now how I was able to make this transition from a polluting designer to a zero carbon designer. See, 15 years ago, happened, and I had to close my first line. And so, similar to now, people felt that fashion was empty, and we were looking for more meaning in our lives. And so I became really fascinated by these costumes of the Miao and the Dong ethnic minority tribes in rural China. I'd seen their costumes in museums all over the world, and I had learned that grandmothers still continue to make and wear these costumes today. It's not going to the next slide. Just okay. And so I learned that the grandmothers still continue to make and wear their costumes today. This is how they identify themselves with their village through their embroidery, which is not only beautiful, it's also a tool to pass down their oral history to the next generation. And so in China, ethnic minority groups make up 8.5% of the population, with the Miao and the Dong being the largest of these groups. But like all indigenous groups around the world, their traditional knowledge is disappearing because of rapid modernization, especially across China. And so I was told their textiles would be gone in the next 5 to 10 years, and to do what the museums are doing and to buy up as many as I could now. But this just made me really angry because I thought, why would we watch it disappear? Why not find a way to keep it going? So I packed up my New York apartment, moved to WHF province, where the Miao and the Dong live, and tried to find a way to keep this knowledge alive. Now, WHF province was one of the poorest provinces. It was the poorest province back then in China, and now it's one of the poorest, but it was rich in natural resources. And it was also really remote and undeveloped because of the harsh mountain and the landscape. And so people in China were also reluctant to go there. But this isolation actually helped preserve their traditional way of life until very recently. And so when I entered their world, I felt like I was going back in time 200 years. And they would make indigo fabric all day, and I moved into the Demon Dong Eco Museum, which was a local nonprofit that I partnered with. And we began starting training programs to have the elders pass down their know-how to the younger generation. And so while I was there, I learned to negotiate with grandmothers, and eventually became fluent in Chinese. And so you may be wondering, wait, you didn't speak Chinese before, and that's right. Because my parents were Chinese, but they had immigrated to the US in the late 50s, early 60s. And so I was born in Indiana, in the middle of the country in the US, where there were no Chinese people around us. And so for me, I never really learned Chinese. I couldn't speak it. I was very removed from my own culture or my own roots. And so going back to China and going to WHF province was kind of like my journey of re-indigenizing myself. And so there I watched them make fabric. They hung them outside their homes and all over the village. The indigo is a natural plant that grows wild across this region of southwest China. And so they used it to paint on fabric with beeswax and make wax-resist designs. And they could create the designs also by using dyed indigo threads on a hand loom or stitch them on top as an embroidery, or they can combine all of them together with wax-resist drawing, hand embroidering, and weaving. And so each one of these techniques, it's like a fine wine. Each village had their own distinct aesthetic based on the climate that they were living in. And so they were also famous for their hand-pleated skirts, which were worn by girls and women in different variations and lengths. And the stitches, which is where I really had to study these because they were different from Western stitches that I had learned sewing growing up. And so after 5 years of living there, training and learning from them, I was ready to design my women's wear collection, but it would take me another 5 years to complete. And so you're asking, okay, so why would it take so long, 5 years to design? Can't you just design a collection in a few months? And yes, you could if you were living in a world with electricity. But without it, my training as a designer in New York just simply didn't work. And so you see here that electricity had not arrived in the village until 1994, which was 15 years before I showed up. And so they continued living mostly without it. Every time it rained, which was every few days, the electricity would be knocked out in the village and it would be gone for weeks. So people just kept carrying on like normal. And they were also so remote, the villages were inaccessible by road. And they didn't have smartphones or internet until 2015. And it didn't reach every home until just 5 years ago. So 5 years ago was really the starting point for turning this vision into a real business. So over those years, we created a network of artisans across the region. We, as I told you, started training programs, and my nonprofit partner now worked with the government to build a new workshop for us, which they now call the Tangandong Ethnic Eco Museum. So we developed a supply chain to turn the fabrics locally into clothing for the market, which also meant pricing out every step of the journey and how much the fabrics would cost because they had never sold their fabrics for anyone and never used them outside of their family. And so we began selling them at Premier Vision within Maison d'Exception, and we did that for the last 3 years before the pandemic. And so with our army of grandmothers, mothers, artisans, and farmers, we got to work. They were all women, and we created a women's wear line directly from nature. So the first lesson I learned was that I had to forget everything that I knew. And what had made my life so efficient in New York City simply did not apply in the mountains. Producing fabric in any color at any time of the year was not possible, and there were no sewing supply stores there, and ordering anything online would take 3 weeks to arrive. So we had to be self-sufficient and make everything with our own bare hands. I had to learn unlearn everything I knew about fashion and let nature become my teacher. And so you'll see here on this timeline of a seat to button garment, the winter time, which is December, January, and February, things really are, it's slow. Nothing happens. It's too cold to do anything. So we're just waiting for Chinese New Year and the springtime to come. And then spring, the summer, and the fall are when production happens. So we follow the seasons. And because we couldn't ship anything in, we had to use what nature provided. So all the materials we used came directly from the ground or the surrounding forest. And if we couldn't find it, if we didn't have it, then we would just have to grow it and then wait for it to grow. And so because of that, all we needed were just 3 ingredients: sun, plants, and mountain water. And so what was grown in our region of Guizhou was local native seed cotton. Each family has 1 mu of land, which is about 0.165 acres. And they're given this land to grow anything they need to eat and survive. So cotton grows from April to August in this region, and then the families rotate this with other vegetables that they plant throughout the year. And because they're growing the same produce that they eat on this soil, they do not use any pesticides in their crops, because these chemicals, they make them feel sick. And so because our cotton is grown on the same soil, there are no pesticides in ours. And so you see here my friend Wu Feila, she's eating a sugar cane that she just pulled straight from the ground in between picking cotton for our collection. And unlike GMO cotton, which has only been around for the past 25 years, native seed cotton doesn't require a ton of water. In fact, in this image, there was a drought. It's a global drought, thanks to climate change, and it did not rain for 2 months straight. And so you can see that the leaves are brown, and yet the cotton was still growing. And so organic cotton, all organic cotton that's used in the world, uses 91% less water than GMO cotton, and it reduces water pollution by 98%, and yet it only makes up 0.6% of global cotton production. So by using native seed organic cotton, we're supporting, this long chain of sustainable practices that are much healthier for people and the planet. And so the next stage is we harvest all the cotton, usually in July, August, September, pick it up, and then we have to de-seed it and start to prep it in order to be spun. Now, we do not use machine spinning. We use hand spinning because my dream then was to produce clothing entirely by hand from scratch, like humans had done throughout human history. We had all done it until 150 years ago when fashion suddenly became so polluting. So in order to do this, we'd have to hand spin the yarn, which is a tradition that's disappearing around the world. And in fact, in this area, it took me 3 years to find grandmothers who still had the knowledge to spin cotton by hand. And so when I finally asked these grandmothers, why is it so hard? Why are people not doing it? They said, it takes so long to spin. And finally, they told me it takes 5 days. And to me, 5 days, it's nothing, but 5 days is enough time. 5 days is enough time for a task where the tradition can disappear in 1 generation. So you can see here the difference between the machine spun yarn, which is on the top, and the hand spun on the bottom, which is much more beautiful and it's much softer when you wear it. And so then the next stage was we set up the yarns on the loom, which takes about a week. And then we start to hand weave the fabric, which could take anywhere from a week to a month, depending on the complexity. And that's a closer detail. Then we wash the fabric using the local mountain water. Since they did not have running water until 2014, the water they collected came from this mountain spring, which was also the village spirit. In fact, it's been flowing like this 24/7 for the last 400 years since their ancestors moved to the village. And since we rinse our fabric in the same water that they wash their vegetables, we have to make sure there are no chemicals in our fabric and that everything is food grade. So we use the raw natural cotton. We don't put any chemicals on it. And so what this means is it keeps the wax of the cotton on the fiber. And so when you have a shirt like this and you have a stain on it, the stain washes out easily. Our natural dye, indigo dyes, are made from, it's a scientific name, Strobilanthes cucea. It grows wild in Guizhou, and so we follow the same technique that's been practiced in China for thousands of years. And so the Miao, they believe that indigo has a soul and it protects those that wear it, a farmer or child or even a house. And then the rural farmers will wear them out in the field because indigo fabrics are cooling, so they'll cool the skin. They are naturally mosquito repellent, and this is perfect for working under the sun in these humid rice paddies. And even our thread, we make sure it's cotton and it gets dyed in the same indigo vat to match. And unlike chemical dyes, indigo is okay for the skin. In fact, it's a natural antiseptic, and it's used to heal skin rashes and dress wounds to aid for healing. So when we get to August, indigo it's a cold water dye, and it can be used throughout the year. It's just that because we don't use electricity and everything is done outdoors, in the winter time the color is a more lighter blue, and then in the summer it's a darker blue. This is just because of the temperature and the rate at which it oxygenates. But in August, this is the only time we can dye yellow from gardenia pods, because these are foraged from the mountain forests, and they have to be used fresh in order to create this vibrant yellow dye. So this is the fruit of the gardenia. It's also a frequently used herb in traditional Chinese medicine that's indigenous to this region, and it's central for dispelling dampness and heat in the body, and it cools the blood down. So they use it topically for burns, to reduce eczema on the face and the neck, and to relieve jaundice. Now the soil outside of our workshop, it's this natural, beautiful, vibrant red color. So we use this to dye our color clay, which you see on the shirt on the right. And wearing the color is it's really great. It feels really grounding on the skin, and it fades just like the plant dyes over time to become more beautiful. After the dyeing stage, the grandmothers then beat the fabric with wooden mallets. Again, these wooden mallets, they're not bought. They are made from the trees on the land that they grow, because everything is local. So they beat them, sometimes for half an hour, sometimes for an hour, 2 hours, depending on how soft we want to get it. And it's kind of like tenderizing meat. You just keep pounding it till it's soft enough, and if it's indigo dyed, it will press the crystals further into the fabric and make them more permanent. So after harvest season in November, if you go to these villages, you'll just hear the whole village just pounding. Everyone's pounding away. So the next stage is we cut the fabric, and again, because we're not shipping anything in, we're using local rocks as our paperweights. And then we have to mark the sewing lines, because we're not using sewing machines, we're hand stitching at all. So we stitch them and then they follow the lines to sew. Now each piece is uniquely hand stitched, and so no two are exactly the same. It carries a personality of the weaver, the dyer, and the final sewer. And so a jacket can take 10 days to sew by hand. A dress might take 6 days, and a pair of pants would take 4 days. And so you can contrast this by fast fashion, where a pair of jeans could take 18 minutes just to sew one pair in a factory. Now, we sometimes do use a foot pedal machine. It's not plugged in, you just use your feet to get it going, but the sewers say it's faster for them to sew by hand. So we use this foot pedal machine very rarely, and only for long straight lines like in this belt in this image. Now there are meow in this another village that grow or raise silkworms. That area is called Danzai, and silk is grown in April inside the homes. They're considered like part of the family, like daughters of the family, and they all have souls. And so between April and June is when the leaves of the mulberry trees are fresh and can be fed to the worms. And those grow in that region, the mulberry trees. Next, we take the silk yarn, and because it's very fine, we start to twist it. And so then we can twist it to make it thicker, and then turn it into like a hand embroidered, a yarn for hand embroidery, which we then use for top stitching, which is here on this shirt. Because silk doesn't dye as well with natural dyes, it doesn't pick up the dye for indigo or for natural dyes in general. This is why it's so bright on this indigo shirt, and so we use that as a design element. That same silk is then used to make our labels. This is on that silk fabric, and then the embroidery thread is embroidered on top. So everything is made within a 25-mile radius, including our labels. And including the buttons, because there are no button shops. And so we have to make our own buttons, and we have to make our own buttonholes. So we don't use any plastics or metals. We just make these hand-knotted traditional buttons all by hand. And then if they're thicker, then they take slices of tree trunks and put them inside fabric and sew them on. And so when finished, each piece going from seed to button can take 5 to 6 months to complete, which seems like a really long time if you do one piece after another. But of course, if you do multiple lots overlapping each other, the production output can be quite fast, especially if you know how to time this according to the cycles of nature. And so unlike most clothing today, which is made from plastics, chemicals, and fossil fuels, our clothing is not made with any of these. And so after this entire journey, after 10 years where my original mission was to strictly follow the traditional techniques from the grandmothers, by the time we finished the clothing, we did calculations, and I was really surprised to find that our clothes had a nearly zero carbon footprint. And so we launched in 2020, and we created the first ever zero carbon women's wear line. And then I calculated our operation in the US and for international shipping as well, and we became climate neutral certified to offset the emissions from the entire business operation. And so if you see on the left how we compare to conventional clothing, our shirt has 0.4 kilograms of CO2e, whereas the average cotton t-shirt has 2.1 and the average poly has 5.5. We don't use any electricity. We don't have any chemical pesticides. We only use 12 liters of water plus all the rainfall that comes, versus 2,700 liters for the average cotton t-shirt. And our pieces are all made within a 25-mile radius versus the average cotton t-shirt, which travels 10,000 miles around the world to be made. And so this is cradle to gate, which means it's from the raw material when the seed is grown up to the factory door. In fact, the average t-shirt, if you calculate the whole footprint, it's around 18 to 20,000 miles. And so I found that this zero carbon design was possible by following these 3 core tenets. One is that it's all natural, that it's locally made, and finally that there's no electricity that's used. And by default, if you follow these 3 tenets, you will not be using any plastics or chemicals. the production will all be local and vertical, so we have no global supply chain issues. And it's entirely handmade now because we don't have, renewable energy sources that can replace that. And it can only be done this way if you're working with traditional know-how and indigenous knowledge. So when we think of climate solutions, we hear so much about the technology part and new inventions. But in fact, indigenous knowledge is also so crucial to finding climate solutions. But of the 7,000 languages that are spoken today, half of them will disappear in our lifetime. And with it, all the knowledge that's been accumulated over generations of how to live with nature. So we need to keep this knowledge alive, and we need to find a way to pass it down to the next generation so that we can enter a zero carbon future. Because if clothes are the first entry point to changing our personal identity, imagine what would happen if we expanded this beyond our bodies, if we expanded zero carbon design to everything in our home and everything that we use in our everyday life. And so if you'd like to join me in this vision, I'm looking for angel investors right now to start our business. I'm looking for partners that want to collaborate and sales and marketing people to join my team in New York. So you can contact me if you're interested at info@angelchang.com, and my line is viewable at angelchang.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angel. Such a beautiful way to end this amazing day of phenomenal speakers. And this idea of maybe rescheduling the fashion schedule based on the cycles of nature is obviously the way to go. And if only everybody could do that, hopefully we've inspired many people to do so.
Yeah.
Lee, are you still?
Yes, I'm here. I'm almost in tears after this day. It's amazing the amount of energy, love, and everybody is pouring this into this forum. Angel, it is remarkable how much endurance you have to come to this work. It's really a monument, I think, to what should be done in the future. And we need to work, we need to help you. I think we need to publish this more. It needs to be more well known.
I think Lee, she's working on a book actually. Is that right, Angel?
Yeah, I'm working on a memoir about my experience and my transformation because I think, it took me 2 years to learn this process, but if I can write about my experience in a book, then people can just read about it and learn and not have to waste those 10 years. They can start, living out in nature and developing these concepts.
That's a very good idea. We can publish the book with you if you want.
Oh my gosh, amazing. That would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Maybe that will be the first World Hope Forum book.
Wow.
We don't have money yet, but we will maybe get it. Today was a very good start. We got a donation of $1,000.
Oh.
So we're super happy because Philip, this hasn't happened yet. And so we hope that in the future, many more friends will be seduced by what we do to enlighten everybody and help us, to finance the forums. But definitely, I want to make books with World Hope Forum, so this could be an early one, I promise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we just have to get the discussion out there because we have to get more people talking about positivity and the future and coming up with solutions. And you can't do that when the media is pushing out fear about the future.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, the books are so important for creativity and exchange.
Well, this day was